Welcome to this month's contract administration practice session. With that, I do want to hand it off to Douglas to get started, as it looks like Jim is trying to call back in, and I will continue to try to get his audio line working as well. So Douglas, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everyone. We are continuing with our discussion on Chapter 11 from the CSI Construction Contract Administration Practice Guide. Let's go to the next slide, Matthew.
Hey, Doug, can you hear me?
Jim, welcome.
Holy smokes. I'm sorry, folks. I don't know what was wrong. I could hear everything you were saying. But go ahead. I'm sorry, Doug. I'll be quiet and jump in a second.
No, we just got started and just went to the first slide. So as I was saying, we're finishing up our discussion on Chapter 11, measurement and payment, where obviously measurement is your quantifying term and payment is just making disbursement or payment on the work that's been quantified. And Jim, now that you're here, I guess I'm going to let you drive or take control. And Matthew, I believe we're ready for the next slide. And Jim, I'll turn it over to you and then I'll jump in.
Okay. I'm sorry, folks. So we ended up last time just before we dove into liens, and we want to talk some about how you negotiate liens on a project as you're making payment and as you're meandering through measurements of what's in place. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the items you see on the screen, and then stop for a minute and let Doug maybe pick out some details to talk about. So in general, what we're looking at are mechanics liens, which are a legal security interest in title to the property for payment in what you have supplied as a contractor as labor or materials. This is something that is in the path of contract between the general contractor and his subs, between the contractor and the owner. But the mechanics liens travel between parties and are solvable or addressable through the performance and payment bonds that many projects typically require the general contractor to provide. So these liens can vary widely depending on the type of work, performance of work, and because of that, often the owner requires a release of liens be executed and provided with the application for payment. So what Doug and I see in North Carolina often is that the general contractor will provide a release of liens and then turns to her subcontractors to provide a release of liens to her as a backup document to the owner. So those would be mechanics liens that are associated with some performance of work on the site. There are also liens that may exist on funds that are because payment has not been made. So this would apply with monies that still are retained by the owner. And it can occur on public projects. It is considered a lien on the funds, though, for construction and not the property. I'm going to stop there and let Doug add more detailed information anywhere in that whole lien process, Doug, that you think would be helpful for us to get a little deeper into.
Okay. So anybody or entity that is supplying materials or performing work on a project has the right to file a lien on the property if they are not paid. And as Jim was saying, like in North Carolina, our legislature has deemed that it is against the public interest for a lien to be on public property. And so you cannot file a lien on property in North Carolina. So if it was a state project, then your alternative would be to file a lien on the funds that are remaining to pay for that property. So that's why Jim's got the two different types up there on the screen. It should be noted that design professionals have been determined to also have a right to file a lien. And when you can file a lien, as Jim says, there's time periods for filing them, and as usually the clock starts ticking on that duration as of the last day that you performed work on that project. And it would start, the earliest you would be able to file a lien would be when you would first have performed some service or provide materials or labor for that project. So once you sign the contract, if you're a general contractor, you can't go out and file a lien. You've got to do some work first. And same thing if you're a design professional. You've got to do some work first before you can file a lien. And so it would be you do some work, you try to get paid, you don't get paid, then you can file a lien. And then the lien on the property versus lien on funds, legally the process is about the same. It's just identifying whether it's going to be on the property or on the funds. And if it's on the funds, then the owner is obligated, once he's notified of that, to hold on to that money until it's been resolved. He can't go out and pay everybody else and use up all his money once he's gotten a lien filed on the money. Then you can't spend it, because once you put that lien on it, you're saying I got a legal claim to it, so it's kind of in limbo until that gets resolved. Do we have any questions, Matthew?
Nope, everyone's quiet, hopefully because they're listening and not because they're also having technical issues.
Okay.
Well, let's touch on something, Doug, just for a second and see if it piques anybody's interest. You know, these, particularly focusing on release of liens, I guess just the straightforward way to say it is people can lie. And we've been on projects, both of us, before where people did lie. And they executed forms and turned them in to us for us to use as information upon which to process an application for payment. And we've done so when, in fact, they really did owe money to other parties. One of the things that we've touched on at other times is the requirement in some states to pay when paid, or to, I just went blank on the other version, to pay if paid. What can we do? This is not just a question to Doug, but have others had that occur to them, and what are some of the things that we might undertake to try to guard ourselves from that occurring?
Well, as the design professional, we do not have a duty to verify that the contractor has paid his subcontractors. And so we are relying on, when they send in a pay app, the release of liens that goes with it, and there's language in on the AIA pay app itself that's a release. We are relying on that information. So if the contractor lies on it and he hasn't paid, and then you get a subcontractor that files a lien on the property, then the owner, because he's gotten that release from the contractor, may be in a position to where he is not responsible for paying that subcontractor, but the general contractor is. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. If not, raise your hand or send in a question.
I think it does. I'll be interested to see if there are stories out there where this has happened to people. And I guess particularly on private work, when you rely on that information and it's been falsified, of course, there are legal actions between the owner and the contractor, and perhaps in some cases between the state and the contractor. I've had that experience where release of liens were signed and that they were absolutely false, and there were many liens that ended up turning into a very lengthy and elaborate litigation for monies. And as Doug said, we rely on that information. I don't know the legality of it, but my practice on job sites is to talk to as many people as I can, as often as I can, and get a sense for how the project is going financially. It's not formal conversation, and it's not necessarily documented conversation, but it seems like to me that you're going to hear if people aren't getting paid, they're not going to be on the site. Materials are not going to be being delivered as they should be, and sometimes those can be indicators of trouble. Sometimes they can be nothing at all. So you got to be very careful about acting on any information that's hearsay. But it certainly doesn't hurt you to be aware and to listen. Matthew, we can go to the next slide. And Doug, if you have anything to add or if there are any hands raised, Matthew.
Still no hands raised at the moment.
Well, another part of our progressing through payment on the project sometimes can become an issue of damages. Often the contracts for public work contain clauses for liquidated damages, which by the signature of the contract is an amount of money that the parties have agreed to that any sort of a breach will compensate them for. Typically that's based around not meeting a schedule, certain milestones in the project. And so that when are liquidated damages used, it is in a case where actual damages are particularly uncertain when the contract is originally signed. It's an approximated amount that would cover damages, what the likely damages might be. It can't be punitive, and it is often deducted from the final payment to the contractor. So, for example, we see these in North Carolina associated with public projects like schools, colleges, community colleges, where it would be difficult for the owner to decide what sort of an impact there may be. Or a classroom building, we're not able to put students in the building at a university level, and that may have some cash flow impact on tuition fees. Or perhaps there is furniture that comes for the project that has to be stored off-site until the building is ready. So those are just a couple of examples of uncertain impacts that may occur on the site. Not in the public work that Doug and I do, but in private work, of course, there may be a bonus clause where the contractor has finished on time or early, and she is due a bonus payment, which also would be something that needs to be addressed and adjusted in the progress payments as the project comes to a close. Doug, anything in addition to that?
I worked in Denver, Colorado for a while, and there was a statute there that required you to have a bonus clause if you had a liquidated damages clause. You could not have one without the other. So if you had liquidated damages, you also had to have a corresponding bonus clause, which was interesting to me in that they're saying as a state that we recognize that an owner could be damaged if his project isn't completed on time. But then again, Mr. Contractor, if you get done early, that's a benefit to the owner. and so he should have to compensate you for that too, which is an interesting way to handle it. I don't know if there are many other states that require the bonus clause if you have the liquidated damages clause, but I know that Colorado did. Matthew, do we have any questions on liquidated damages?
It doesn't look like we have any hands raised, and nobody has typed in a question yet.
Great. Well, let's go to the next slide. And as we are coming into the home stretch of a project and making payments, making those final measurements, and we're getting down to the phases where we start to determine substantial completion, which is the first step in closing the project and reaching final payment. So what is substantial completion? Well, we probably could take an hour phone call just to talk about the different definitions and the different perspectives around substantially complete. Doug and I describe that as a project being ready to be used for the purpose for which it was intended. So if you're building a bakery and you want to make biscuits, then you can make biscuits and nobody is going to stop you from doing so. Now, substantially complete from other perspectives, particularly within the construction team, may sound very different and be presented in a very different way. But our contracts establish substantially complete just as that first bullet point defines. So with progress payments, we've been making along, measuring a percentage, perhaps, or a period of time that has passed, a quantity of work. When we get to the substantial completion phase, then we're also doing the same thing. So we're measuring the final pieces of the work. We're not establishing that it is yet acceptable, but we are just stating that it is at a milestone in the project where we will pay for it. There will be final inspections and punch lists to follow of things that are finally done and that are complete that may need addressing, and those lists will be compiled and we will verify that they are or they are not. But we're not, one of the important things to always remember, we're not accepting work that's not completed properly and in accordance with the contract documents. At this point in the project, maybe we have reduced retainage before. Some contracts allow that the contractor not have to figure any more retainage in the project after 50%. Others do not allow that, but that's a possibility. And so retainage may be reduced again at substantial completion. You know, in the instances we all have had where project has gone well, everyone's happy, it's clear that things are going to finish well and without issue between the parties. You may have an opportunity to build some very goodwill and process a pay application to reduce substantial completion.
Jim, I'm going to interrupt real quick as you finish this.
Absolutely.
Be interested to hear from the group if anyone has any stories they would like to share about substantial completion, whether there was a disagreement between them and the contractor or them and the owner, or any kind of stories, issues around substantial completion that they would like to share or be willing to share with the group. Sorry, Jim. So Matthew, if you can just let us know if anybody has anything that they want to share, that would be great. And Jim, sorry to interrupt, but we can keep going while they're hopefully joining in with participating.
Yeah, no, man, that's fantastic. Stories are always better. And so, Matthew, just holler if somebody raises their hand and wants to share one. And so there's one thing that I want to be sure and point out this last bullet item here. Often, I think as a profession, the design professionals are a little bit timid about discussing who's responsible for additional costs. So if the contractor is found to be responsible because things were extended, substantial completion is a time, well, actually when those impacts occur is the right time to talk about it. But if the project has extended beyond its completion date, there may be additional services that are required from the designers, the architects, engineers, facility managers, commissioning, whomever. Then there may be some payment due, and certainly we as professionals need to think about that, to monitor those costs, and to be comfortable in raising that issue with our clients, with the team. I find that we often don't do that because we're not perfect and we have made errors. There have been omissions. There were things that could have gone better within the project, and so we're hesitant to raise our hand in a circumstance like this. But as a profession, I think we need to think about that and give it contemplative thought before we just dismiss that as an opportunity. Matthew, any hands up?
I've still not seen any hands.
Well, let me just add in on substantial completion that just because you get a certificate of occupancy from your authority having jurisdiction, that does not necessarily mean that they've reached substantial completion. You can get your certificate of occupancy and there still be work that needs to be completed in order for the facility to be able to be used for its intended purpose.
We did have
that's a great... Oh, go ahead, Matthew.
I was just going to say, we had a comment that came in here from Eugene. He says, I've dealt with substantial completion in a university setting. Typically, we would not pursue damages in condition with the remaining performance due.
I'm not sure I understood that. I think he's saying that on like a university project, if they've met substantial completion on time, that if there's some remaining punch list items, they typically don't go after damages for those completion of those punch list items. And I think that is a reasonable approach. My caution would be making sure that those punch list items are done in a reasonable time and they don't drag out. I have seen in contracts where you put a liquidated damage amount on getting the work to substantial completion and then putting in a lesser liquidated damage amount to get from that substantial completion to final completion. And that was done just so that, again, that process didn't drag out, because as we all know, that last 5% of the work seems to take more time than it should. And we just want to make sure that doesn't get dragged out too far.
That's true. Well, Doug brought up a point that is really important and about the definition of substantial completion not necessarily being when the authority having jurisdiction was willing to issue a certificate or an occupancy permit. And in some cases, I have seen firms have a section in their supplementary general conditions to define precisely what they are agreeing to as substantially complete, and therefore putting it into the bid documents that the general contractor is using. Because in the scenario that Doug just described, I had that exact experience with a school. And when it's a public school, Oftentimes there's been redistricting involved. An elected school board has gone through that redistricting process, so many people are angry. School board members are worried about re-election. There have been breakups of middle schools or high schools, and so team members are split up and bands are split up, and everyone is unhappy. And so the necessity of hitting a due date and getting a building open is based on a school calendar that's been approved 2 years prior. So the pressure to get it open is there, and the school system has no other real choice in their minds. So, for example, they can open the building and they've got rooms that are ready to hold class in, and they've got playground facilities and sports facilities to back up the programs, but they don't have a cafeteria or a kitchen. And so many times they've been able to cordon that area off and say, you know what, we've got a school down the road, we'll bring bag lunches for the first 2 weeks, we have to open the building. So is that substantially complete? And can you write a definition of substantial completion sufficient to cover all possible scenarios? Well, probably not all, but you certainly can include many of them. And in cases where you may have projects that can open portions or in a phased sort of process, it may be smart for you to include in the documents and the specifications and in your general conditions those definitions. So you don't have to argue that in the heat of the moment, but have that worked out ahead of time. Any hands up, Matthew?
No, everybody is still quiet.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the next slide and start to talk about final payment.
Okay, Eugene, it looked like your hand was up for a few seconds. Just send me a chat message if you had another question or something else you'd like to ask.
So that brings us to the point of final payment. This is when the work is finally accepted and the designer, the engineer, the architect are making sure that all closeout procedures have been completed. And that's a simple statement to make, that all the closeout procedures have been completed, but that is a lengthy and detailed process. Many moving pieces and parts to the final conclusion of a project. And I guess I would back up a second and say, when you make that final payment, you're done. And it is critical that you are sure that everything that is supposed to be done, that everything included with the contract documents has been completed in accordance with those documents before that final payment is made. So if, for example, in many cases we see allowances included where we may be concerned about unsuitable soil, we don't want the owner to be surprised, we've included $5,000 in the contract to deal with that. There was no unsuitable soil, but that was back when we were doing grading. Nobody's looked at that part of the application in 2 years. We weren't thinking about that. The contractor sent us a final application and we paid it. And lo and behold, we find out that we forgot to take that allowance money out of the contract with a deductive change order. So it's important that, because we've created these documents, that we go through them very closely to decide where we are in that final payment, that allowances or unit prices, any kind of adjustments have been made, and that we process final change orders, that those are all confirmed as documented and signed, So in that allowance case, there'd be a deductive item in a change order or in the final change order. But that if there are any outstanding change orders that they've been processed, to be fair to the contractors, and be sure that they are paid for everything that they have done on the project. Because if they've done additional work, and it is in fact extra work and should be in a change order, but we have neglected to get that processed, and we process a final pay application, that contractor is going to lose that money. On a public project in North Carolina, when they cash that check, they're done. And there's no way to go back and get public money to pay them if that were missed. So it's important to go through those documents and verify all these things complete. So the contractor is submitting these final documents, indemnifying the owner. They're giving you all of the waiver of claims and release of liens documents. The owner is doing the same thing in the processing of this final payment, waiving their claims, except something that is documented that's an unresolved issue with a lien, or perhaps if in time there is defective work that surfaces that wasn't caught, or it didn't appear until after the final inspection. So, Doug, I'm going to stop talking. I'm saying too much there, and see if you have any comments to add about the final payment process.
I would add that don't forget your consent assurity to final payment form. AIA has a standard form, CSI has a form. But if you've had a job that is bonded, you need to make sure that you get that form as well with these final closeout documents. Record drawings, record specifications, anything that you've listed in there that is a part of the scope of work, it's in the contract, that they need to provide at the end of the job, you need to make sure you have all of that stuff in hand before you sign off on that final payment application. I have held final pay apps that were quite large, because they were large projects, because of one document or one set of record drawings, and I was supposed to get 3 copies. He got me 2 copies. I needed the 3rd copy. So just make sure you get all that stuff in hand before you sign off on that final payment application. Matthew, anything from the group?
I'm not seeing anything at the moment.
That's a great point Doug just made, and one that puts you in a very bargain positive position, and something that you shouldn't abuse. But it certainly makes a big difference when you're in a position to have substantial money for something that should be pretty simple to close out. We all get busy and people move on to other projects, and so sometimes having that extra push of attention is a good thing. Well, let's take a look at the next slide and talk about why all this matters in processing these pay applications. We'll sort of wrap up with the slide after this one to talk in a little more detail about how you might manage some of this risk, or what this slide defines as exposure. So we're executing a document, and I'll use the AIA document as an example. We're certifying, and that's an important word to understand the ramifications of. So what might happen when we're processing these pay applications to our client as far as potential claims? Well, we may feel like we are right in our estimation of the percentage of work that's complete, and that could be wrong, and we may under-certify or underpay the prime general contractor. and not recommend enough payment for what they have in place. They could make a claim centered on that. As well could the subcontractors for the same reason. We've maybe certified too little, knowing that maybe there's more work in place, or perhaps we know that they haven't been paid. And we have certified an additional payment with that knowledge. Now, we should have a release of liens. We've got a lot of checks and balances to keep these things from happening, but sometimes they do. There could be a claim from the surety that for the same reasons we've underpaid on the project to the prime contractors or subcontractors, and that may have caused an issue, a default in a sub, for example, that then has to fall to the surety to take over the work. So now they've had an impact because of an underpayment. Or just as similarly, we could overpay and not leave sufficient funds to get the work done. And again, the surety may end up taking over some work or being in a responsible position when there are insufficient funds. We could also have claims from our client, from the owner, for these same reasons, whether we have under-certified or over-certified with applications, and those claims would end up coming back to the client in either case for whatever various reasons. So we are exposed at times in the processing of these pay applications to potential claims, and as we're going, again, just another emphatic message to be very diligent and detailed in what we do in undertaking the certification of an application for payment. Doug, any of those examples you want to dive deeply into?
Not unless someone has a question. I would mention that last time we did talk about having your schedule of values broken down in a manner that will help you to be able to make this determination for what you're certifying. And I just want to reemphasize that point here, is that in order to not under-certify or over-certify, if you've got that schedule of values broken down, that will go a long way towards you not having to worry about over-certifying or under-certifying for the work that's been completed. It's easy to see if you've got a 3-story building that's got 2 wings. It's easy to have that, if that schedule of values broken down, and you can go and see on the second floor all of the plumbing fixtures done, and so on the schedule of values is broken out on wing A, second floor. Here's the schedule for the plumbing work. It's easy to be able to say, yeah, it's all there. Here's the dollar value on the certificate on the application for payment, to go ahead and certify that as being done. Whereas if it was just bumped into one number that said plumbing for the whole building, and some of it's on the 3rd floor, some of it's on the 1st floor, and is it 50%, is it 100%? Having that breakdown in that schedule of value just goes a long way to helping to make sure you don't get into one of these claim situations where you've over-certified something or under-certified something. Matthew, before we jump to the last slide, anything from the group? They've been awful quiet this month.
They have been quiet. I'm going to blame it on the heat going across the country.
Oh my gosh. Well, let's go to the last slide. And one of the things that Doug has taught me over the years that we've been doing things together is, if you think completely and totally through a project, a lot of your time needs to be spent in the, I'll call it risk management part of the project. We're quick to think about the pieces and parts as constructors, as engineers, as designers. We enjoy the focus on the assembly and the search for the right pieces and parts, I guess, but we typically do not spend time thinking on how to manage our risk. Now, having said that, that has become an industry in and of itself, and certainly we've learned a lot over the years how to do that. So the first one that I love here that I have never been able to do myself is to, for example, eliminate the duty to certify a payment. So the language is on the typical forms that we use. It doesn't mean that it has to stay there. And it doesn't mean that you have to use it as the form has been created. It doesn't mean that there aren't other forms that can be uniquely created for the project. But this is one of the things that Doug has talked about before, and how you, and I won't try to describe that, I'll let Doug do that, and how you eliminate the duty in your contract to certify the pay application. But I'll jump ahead and hit these and then I'll be quiet. As Doug just said, establishing a good and accurate schedule of values in great detail has always been my best tool to managing the measurement and payment process of a project. It gets a lot of pushback in the beginning of the job because it's more work perhaps than the project manager or the project engineer or the home office want to invest early in the job. But once I've gotten people to do that and we've spent some time, several months on the project, they see how much faster, quicker, cleaner it can be with that level of detail. So it certainly helps us minimize the risk if we're able to be more accurate with what we see. And using documents like AIA and CSI and EJCDC that have had documents in place for decades, that have been litigated, that are solid with the information that's in them. Can't overemphasize using the right people with experience on the job and being sure that they are comfortable and current with what they're doing in the building type and the delivery method type on the job. And then don't forget to be fair and accurate. You know, we're, as design professionals, we're supposed to play a role that is impartial. And if we show that, if we're diligent about that across the project life, it certainly helps us to be more of a team member and minimize our liability to some degree. So let me be quiet, Doug, and go back to the eliminating your duty to certify and see if you can add some words around that. That would be great.
Well, I've never been able to do that either, but if you are not certifying the application for payment, then you have eliminated that exposure or that risk of having over-certified or under-certified the amount that going to be released to the contractor. As you said, Jim, you can modify the language that's on the AIA documents to eliminate that or change it, and that is one way to help minimize your liability there. To add to that list, and Jim, you mentioned it, be diligent. Make sure that you are making your site visits at appropriate times and appropriate amounts, looking at the proper stuff, having your consultants do what they need to do. And I think if you do all of that, then your chances of getting into trouble are greatly reduced. And we've got, this is our last slide. Matthew, as we asked for the last time this month if there are any questions, I wanted to mention that we've got one more chapter of the practice guide that we will hit on next month. And
right.
If no one's seen it, I would encourage you to get a copy of it. they have the CSI forms in there. And Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, I think once you buy the practice manual, you're able to use those forms. You don't have to go out and purchase the forms themselves.
There are some forms that are usable within the document. Not all the forms that are included are that way, but there is a download portion, and those forms you can use as often and as much as you want.
And we probably should do this next time too. Share the information, and Matthew, you may be able to help out with this as to where they can get a copy of the practice manual.
Yep, no problem. Next month for the recap, not only will I have all that, but I'll also be taking all of these slides from all of the sessions, and I'll have that as a downloadable file during the session as well, so you can download all slides and then go back and review everything for the whole. I think this ended up being like a 15-part series, so